It's been a long day. It's been a very interesting day. We've got so many different views. I want to dive straight into it with your first impressions, Susan. I know you get the chance to travel through, I'm looking at your accreditation through many areas of the globe, including Singapore. First impressions of our sunny little island, rainy right now.
Well, Singapore? Well, I think, to be honest, I think Singapore's reputation precedes it. Long before I physically stepped foot in Asia, and indeed Singapore, I was very much aware of Singapore as a global business hub. And to that extent, you know, a place that had expanded beyond its geographical area and was really playing a sort of critical role in the global economy. And myself, from a small island like the UK, I very much empathize and understand that ambition to actually operate beyond your geographical area. I think having hit the ground in Singapore, it's obviously incredibly efficient, very easy to operate from a hub for the region, to fly in and fly out. If anything, I sometimes wish it wasn't quite so easy to fly out so that I could spend longer here enjoying the city in particular.
Chili crab. So. That's all I'll say. Try the chili crab. But my point about that is that the very first thing that you said, that its reputation precedes us, does that serve us well, or is it a double-edged sword?
I think from my perspective, and I see similar discussions to this taking place around the world, particularly throughout my region, it can be both a benefit and a risk. I think, you know, having that aspiration to operate globally is indeed a benefit, to think beyond your own local environment. But on the other hand, it can also lead to complacency. And I think, you know, you need to ensure that you're also keeping up with the world that's changing around you. And particularly a highly competitive world. You mentioned I cover a fairly large geographical space. And what's interesting is to see the innovation happening not just in the hubs we all know of, but actually in the places we least think of. Take Kenya, take you know, parts of Southeast Asia, take parts of the Middle East, where you step off the plane and you see that same energy and hunger for technology. And I think particularly as technology has gone mobile first in many parts of the world, there are huge opportunities for those parts of the world to leapfrog some of the environmental constraints or just complacencies that we've got used to in the more emerged world. So I think being small is also an opportunity, because I think you inherently look outwards, and we've seen some great success stories around the world for countries that look outwards. Take Israel. Take Korea, which is now playing a global role in online culture, having, you know, looked outwards from its own backyard. So I think there are opportunities to, yes, think locally, but also don't cut off the opportunity of the globe. In fact, my recommendation would be start global work backwards, or if you're thinking locally, think scale, because the internet is inherently global. So why would you limit your potential, at least?
I think Google then is the best case study that we can all benefit from. Julian, talk to us a little bit about that, because I know that as large an entity as it is, it's still got that hunger and drive as a very startup kind of feel and engine behind it in terms of how it operates. Talk to us about this culture of innovation and why it's so prevalent and so pervasive.
Well, it starts for us with actually not wearing a suit. I think I was saying to one of you guys, I think it was Steve, that I probably wear a suit once a month.
Under the big yeah. We're very privileged, thank you very much.
This is as smart as we get.
This is as smart as it gets. And we're talking about the bankers. It's funny because when people from Google meet bankers, generally we dress up.
What do Googlers
and they
wear?
Dress down. Well, a lot of people wear flip-flops and t-shirts.
Okay.
But they wear what they want, where they can be most creative. And I think one of the most interesting things that came out of the panel to me was what Bruno was saying. He captured it brilliantly. I think he said innovation in the cafe, not the lab. And I think if you take that as a proxy for how we look at innovation, it starts with the culture you have. And a lot of the discussion today was very interesting about, well, we've got money in Singapore, we've got the infrastructure, we've got all these ingredients, but the cake is not right. And I think the things we've learned, what I've learned from being in the company 8 years, is that unless you've got the culture and the openness of the culture, it's very difficult to innovate and innovate quickly. And you know, the cafe is a great analogy, because you know, Google's kind of renowned for its free food, and you do put on about £10 working there in the first few months.
Google Chef is an actual title, right?
Yes, it's a chief food officer, almost. that's important because that's an environment in which people can mingle and they can innovate. And we've had many product innovations like Google News actually come through discussions in the cafe rather than any sort of lab. So I think lack of formality within the company, an openness, a willingness to challenge hierarchy as well. You've got a lot of people who are willing to stand up and challenge, break a bit of glass. And I think that comes with some disruption within the organization, and but it's a very positive disruption. Ultimately, it leads, we believe, to more innovation.
I'm very Singaporean. I'm just going to say, if that happens, got any like repercussions?
No, I mean, we have mechanisms. We have this thing called TGIF. You know, thank goodness it's Friday, or thank goodness it's Thursday.
Anybody could just stand up and ask something.
Anyone can stand up, and that, you know, that's from the receptionist through to the senior SVPs. And you know, you do have situations where, you know, you've got people challenging the CEO as to why they've changed the M&M color in the kitchen, through to strategy on Android. So keeping that soul of a startup, even as we get bigger as a company, is a challenge, but it's something that perhaps we'd like to see more of within the Singapore business culture, actually. So that fits into some of the themes we've talked about in terms of risk and creating an environment where it's okay to fail. And just on that point, when I was taking notes, I was thinking, it's not about, we keep using the word failure. I think one of the more useful things we can try and do is to redefine failure. And we tend to look at it more as iteration. So when you talk about products, we've launched a lot of products that haven't worked, right? In the traditional sense. But what we've done is we tried to iterate on those products, take the bits that haven't worked, take the bits that did work in those pieces, and build from that. So I think if we can re-engineer, reframe the word failure, it becomes more healthy and acceptable. And that's something, but just by calling it failure, it seems to be a very binary thing. Either you failed or you succeeded. I think one of the other examples, I was dealing with a Singaporean company recently, quite a traditional company, which will remain nameless, where a mistake happened in the partnership on their side with us, and they immediately fired 2 of these people. And it's a shame because it's actually a loss in sense of the learning that can come from that. Right? And the panel was earlier talking about learning from your failures. It should be incubated, that failure, or that as an opportunity to succeed.
I love the idea of redefining the failure as well. Drawing on this spirit of innovation, Susan, talk to me then about how Google deals with different areas with different policies and different regulations in place, which might not always be so welcoming to the idea of challenging authority or going your own way.
I think I'll come on to that. I think first of all, I'd just like to build on what Julian was saying about innovation can come from anywhere. And I think that applies as much to a country as to a company. And I think there's a philosophy about accepting that innovation can come from any level of hierarchy, from any part of the institution or organization, and actually embracing that and allowing that to happen. It's not about your title, it's not about what the name, what the label on the door says. It's about understanding that within your institution, your company, your country, some of the best ideas do not necessarily come from that central location that you might have expected. So it's about understanding and accepting the philosophy that no one individual or one institution or government department has a monopoly on the best ideas. And as I say, I think you can embrace that in government and in public policy as much as you can in any company. And I think that leads on to the comment that if you start from that position, that the best ideas can come from anywhere, you're going to want to approach regulation and policy making in a very enabling sense. It's not about codifying what already exists, has been successful in the past, but it's about enabling those ideas to flow through the system, to reach the top, to reach successful points either domestically or internationally. And I think around the world, not just in this region, you see governments and policymakers still trying to operate in a world that predated social media, that predated an open internet, that predated this inherently open mechanism, this inherently decentralized, this inherently global this increasingly mobile, this increasingly multinational environment without central gatekeepers. And I think what you see are elements where they're still trying to codify that. And I think we heard that in the discussion today, that the first instinct is to codify what's happening, whether it's a definition, what is information, what is financial information, what is cultural information, what is the internet, what is social networking. And I think I understand where that comes from. It's the traditional role of governments and particularly policymakers to think like that. But when those ideas can come from multiple channels, multiple sources, are inherently global, then I think what you need to do is to take a more risk-based approach to regulation and to policy making. And what I mean by that is embrace the opportunities and the new ideas and the potential that can come from these new media, and address the issues that they may throw up, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't address the issues such that you lose the opportunity that this new medium offers.
Can I build on that point? Because I think it's really important. Is the backdrop to this is enormous, right? So if you think about where the internet was in 2000, it was very much a Western medium, right? You know, there was some usage in Asia, but relatively small. You fast forward sort of 12, 13 years, and really the center of gravity of the internet has moved to Asia. And that has big implications. I mean, we're seeing...
Has it, or has it been about a lot of Asian talents are moving to other hubs?
I'm talking more about users.
Okay.
So if you look at the backdrop, it's, you know, there's literally hundreds of millions. I mean, from 2010 to 2015, there's 1 billion new users coming online. Many of those are in emerging markets in this region. And so there's this backdrop of huge consumer usage, which, building on your point, makes it a little bit scarier. But from our perspective, it really makes us a huge business opportunity and a huge opportunity for users to grow the digital economy in each country. And I think regulators and governments are starting to see the value that the internet can bring to their economy, their wider economy. I think there's this view that there's this internet and e-commerce, and that's in a little parcel over here, and then there's this real economy over here. There's a strong correlation between having a strong digital economy and having a strong real economy. And there's a real effect now that can be tracked.
And increasingly so.
And increasingly so. So against that backdrop, you've then got, well, who's going to dominate? Which countries and markets are going to be very important in this? And I think the jury's out a little bit in terms of Singapore, because you've got a lot of the foundation, a lot of the ingredients, but there's some elements, I think some of the panelists highlighted, where there's a lot of work that needs to happen. We talked a little about also about talent in the education system. Certainly when we've gone and spoken, well, I've gone and spoken to some of the universities, there is this fear around failing, fear around grades, and I went and spoke at one university, and I explained that, you know, I didn't know what I really wanted to do till I was 25, and in a world where all the information is accessible through this device, knowledge is not going to necessarily differentiate you. It's how to think, it's your attitude, and what you learn at university is, what I learned at university is how to live with 4 complete strangers. And that's equipped me better than necessarily the knowledge from the course. So I had people come up to me afterwards.
And they learned to live with you.
Yeah, they had to learn to live with me, right? But people came up to me afterwards and said, thank God someone's saying that. And I was getting dirty looks from some of the lecturers, because I shouldn't be saying this, that, you know, you don't necessarily have to know what you need to do. But there was this sense that they're on a battery hen system, and that, you know, it's much more acceptable to be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, let's bring a banker, and being in a startup, going home and telling your mum or your dad you're going to do a startup was seen as a bit risky. So I think there's that cultural element as well in Singapore that I think people are aware of, and we've discussed at length on the panel, that needs to be addressed too.
Okay, I want to open it to the floor in just a moment before we continue. Any questions? It's not often that you get the opportunity to address your questions to these two Googlers, so go for it. Hands up. Man in the center there.
There was a lot of talk about Google's way in innovating, and I'm just wondering, what's the personal cost to Google engineers who do not innovate? And I just want to have some insights about what it costs them, because when...
Do you want to know if people get fired from Google? Is that what you're asking?
I'm thinking that they don't get fired, they still have their lunch at the cafeteria every day. So there's a little risk for them when they innovate. What happens to, I would just also find out, what happens to them when they fail to innovate or they fail in the process of innovating? Because where normal people, like salaried people like us, innovate, we give up a salary to do so. So to say, what makes them so different from how we think?
So here's exactly, I would challenge the premise of the question. The question is oriented around failure or what happens as a punishment if something doesn't happen. You've highlighted to me what the problem is. The problem is that what we should be talking about is what happens to those engineers that really get involved in projects that really succeed. What happens to them? I think a lot of, and that's not a funny way of not answering the question, but it just strikes me a lot of the questions come from a negative perspective. We often have CFOs come into the office and they, from Singaporean companies, and they say, why are you wasting all this money on the food and the ping pong table and this stuff? And it's not a question of cost, it's a question of value. Right? So we try to operate that. So coming back to your question with engineers, the penalty is that we don't work on those products, right? We gravitate towards products that are working. You feed the winners, if you like, and starve the losers in some senses, right? And you know, there's an average of about 3.5 engineers on some products, and some products and some algorithms, for example, in search can be started, conceptualized, and be brought to fruition within 48 hours. So if you can imagine a system where we migrate to things that are working whilst we're iterating and accepting some form of failure, that's kind of the environment that's kind of worked for us. But that's not to say we have all the right answers. This is not kind of, there's other elements to it.
Just to add to that, there's a very practical follow-up when that does happen as well, is that engineer will do what we call a post-mortem. What went wrong? What did we learn from that? What are the learnings that I can share with my colleagues to ensure that we build on those lessons for the future? And that will happen in a no-blame environment. So it's not about finding who, it's not about pinpointing who was responsible for that failure, but it was collectively as a team. What did we learn from that? And how can we ensure that in future we don't make those same mistakes? And in fact, what about the surprising element in this? What can we do with that surprising element that will inform our future innovations? So there is both the immediate exercise, which, as I say, rests in that no-blame culture, and, as Julian said, then a broader environment of looking at what's possible, not just looking at what isn't possible.
I think one of the other elements to add to that is this sense of incrementalism. What we're trying to avoid is a 10% gain can be seen as very important, but we're trying to encourage people to think a 10x gain and think big and have the license to think big and not to seek permission. I think that came up as I think you were talking about having to ask permission first. Trying to build within the culture of innovation a sense that permission does not need to be sought before you go out and do things is kind of important as well.
So this idea of audacious ideas is very important to your founder as well. It trickles down to everybody, but are these audacious ideas out of the realm of possibility? Are they just said for the sake? I mean, how do we know that they're said within a context where, we can work towards it?
I think quite often it's about identifying problems around you and looking and thinking, wouldn't it be great to solve those problems without setting limitations today on how you might solve those problems? If you think about the experimentation with driverless cars, huge traffic problem, huge accidents problem. The biggest cause of accidents is human beings. So how do you think big about how you deal with the challenges that we as human beings face? And don't just think about small, as Julian said, not just thinking about small product improvements, although that happens too, but really thinking, are we looking at this in the wrong way? Are there different ways to look at this? And I think just linking that to your earlier question on how does a country replicate that environment? You can imagine that in my job, I spend a lot of time being asked by governments around the world, how do we recreate Silicon Valley? And some of them will move towards putting in place an ICT park. And it's all about the buildings, it's all about the real estate. And we have some really interesting conversations about the fact that, yes, of course, there are buildings in Silicon Valley, there's highways connecting these buildings, but actually that's just one very small part of the equation. In addition to that sort of hard infrastructural layer, and access is part of that, and let's not forget that we live and work in parts of the world that are lucky enough to have that access. There are many parts of the world where we're still collectively working to make that possible. But in addition to that hard infrastructure, you've got the soft infrastructure. And I think that came up today, the access to capital, the access to great people, a predictable environment to operate from. And then the third layer is this culture. You know, what is it that excites people to be there? And quite often that won't be buildings, although a good cafe with Wi-Fi is often a good starting point for a hub. But people want to be motivated by successful and interesting people. You saw from our last presentation just the energy and vibrancy that flows from that commitment to doing something that matters. And I think that's what also attracts innovators. Entrepreneurs want to be energized by other entrepreneurs. There's a great culture of exchanging information and allowing those ideas to flow freely rather than jealously guarding them in one place. And I think that's also what unleashes the potential and then in turn the business opportunity. And I think unlike any communications technology at any point in history today, we are living with the most incredible opportunity. You know, a technology development that connects every one of us in this room with potentially every other person in the world. I think it's a technology that is potentially more inclusive globally than any other technology in time. There is no central gatekeeper. There is no permission-based mechanism. Anyone in this room has the same opportunity to create the next Google, the next Amazon, as anyone in any part of the world who is connected. And I think if that doesn't excite individuals with the ideas that they can bring, that they can contribute to this world, then I don't know what does, because it's an unprecedented opportunity, and it's still the exciting thing that drives me in this space today.
That was very empowering, Susan. I'm going to create an app tomorrow. I don't think it'll work. I'm going to take a few questions. I'm down to my last 13 minutes, so I'm going to take back-to-back questions because we want to get as many in as possible. So, hands up, who's got a question for our Googlers? You can't ask about job opportunities, huh? Bertha?
I think we'll take those two.
Microphone coming to Bertha.
Okay, sorry for being practical again. Thank you for the presentation, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like utopia to me. Yeah, and
we can't understand the idea of not having regulations, is it, Bertha?
Yes. How do you know that?
In a penalty kind of way.
Yeah. So basically, it seems to me that I mean, it might work in your context in America or maybe in parts of Europe, but in Asia, where you know, where the patriarch, I mean that in all senses of the word, plays a great part. If you want to have mindset shifts, cultural changes, it must come from the top, don't you think? And essentially, even if you want to outfit a cafeteria with Wi-Fi, it must come from the top too. So if the top is resistant to change, then you can't possibly have the kind of arrangements that you have, that you know you've talked about. Not that I don't want it, I want it too. Can I go work there? Okay.
Job applications outside. Thank you both. I'm going to take one more question very quickly. Do you want to raise your hand now, or you want to wait for the answer? Anyone? No. Let's deal with this issue then. Can it work? Larry Page is your CEO, and it's being one of the founders and filtering it down. Is that what gives you the benefit? The fact that your founder believes and it's top down?
Well, it comes back to having a clear vision and mission. I mean, Google's one of the few companies I've worked in where there's a lot of companies, you see the mission that's espoused from the top is put away in a drawer somewhere and never looked at, right? But our mission, organize all the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful, is built into the DNA of the company, and so is the idea of not being a conventional company. So from that respect, the patriarchal view from the top was a very positive one about open and free-flowing information, about a broad vision, about empowering consumers. So you could argue from that sense, we've been set as a company a great example from the top. But I would come back to what I was talking about earlier on about the culture and how it works. As much information flows down, more information needs to flow upwards. And you cannot succeed you know, and scale a company unless you open up the airwaves. Most of the best innovations happen on the ground level, whether it's in a factory or a restaurant. It won't be necessarily the boss that comes up with that. It will be someone who's actually doing the kind of day-to-day. So facilitating an environment which allows that information to flow is important. In terms of how a government would see it, again, for me, it comes back to this connection about when you do it, it has a massive positive effect to the economy. and to every people's everyday lives, whether it's a hotel in Singapore that suddenly gets a digital presence and then can be broadcasting their message for travelers around the world. This technology is enabling all sorts of things that weren't possible before, and this is going to have a very strong economic impact. And I think increasingly governments are seeing that there is a positive side to this. It's not all negative. And I guess we're trying to encourage that view based on the results that we're seeing in digital economies around the world.
To do that, you need the right... Sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to add, and that's exactly one of the reasons we hold events like this globally, big tent discussions, where we can actually have open, interactive discussions about what the internet means for a country, for society, for the economy, for cultural diversity, etc., etc. Because it does change things and it does offer new opportunities, and rather shy away from that or have a fear of embracing change. We really want to show that there are more opportunities than reasons to be fearful. And I think when it comes to governments, there's also a sense, and I completely understand this, having worked in a government institution myself in the past, I think we collectively have to work as a society also to give governments and policymakers permission not to have all the answers. As I say, one of the reasons there is this rush to define everything, to codify everything, is because traditionally that was the channel from which these decisions were taken and the guidance was given. As we move into a much broader multi-stakeholder environment where user-generated content is as connected as any government department or business organization, we actually, as I say, we have to embrace that open discussion. The world is complex. We shouldn't expect individual institutions to be able to give the one solution to everything, and should instead engage in that conversation. That's exactly why we come to events like this, is exactly why we have public policy departments, to really engage in that and show the benefits as well as the reasons to be fearful, and collectively to give permission to move forward, again, exactly as was discussed, where ideas and solutions don't necessarily have to come from the center.
I'm going to do a quick fire round in my last remaining minutes, and we'll take one more question. So just bear with me a little bit, quick fire back and forth. Susan, let me start with you. This idea of 10x thinking, shooting for the moon, culture of innovation. You need the right people to, I don't want to say buy into that, but believe that, and who wholeheartedly want to do that as well. A big theme of our last panel discussion was getting the right people. How do we ensure that Google gets the right people?
Well, I think as someone who joined, has worked for some of the most creative, innovative companies on the planet, I still feel inadequate every single day because I'm challenging myself of what more can I do? What other ideas can I have? How can I improve things? And I think you have to unleash that willingness in individuals to want to contribute. And that's where the danger of being too top-down prescriptive, whether it's from a CEO or any other individual in any other organization, could actually kill the very passion that is what people want to contribute. And I think increasingly amongst younger generations, you're seeing much more desire to align with who you are, with what you do. Not simply taking a job, but really taking a job that allows you to maximize your own interests, your own skills, and your own potential. And I think that's fabulous.
That's picking up on what Bruno was saying earlier as well, around, innovation is not necessarily around how much people are paid or their status, but around, feeling a sense of purpose.
Internal locus of motivation, they say, is always far greater than the external. But very quickly, I do want to ask you as well, Julian, you talked about the best ideas can come from anywhere. Now, I'm not saying this happens in my organization, but how do we make sure, does it really come from anywhere? Like, does middle management take credit?
Well, not in my department, actually. All the best ideas actually come from me, as I've told my team, but that would probably be the rare exception. No, it's genuinely true. I think one of the things that technology can do also is facilitate the surfacing of ideas. Having a global company means we've got people in 100 offices, and technology does enable also people to communicate, and so communication tools within an organization also fundamentally important, critical ingredient of opening up the airwaves, and that's one thing. Obviously, we're a technology company, so we have great video conferencing and stuff like that. But if you do those things, then you give yourself the opportunity to generate ideas from all sorts of parts of the company.
And Julian mentioned earlier TGIF, which we now do on Thursday, so that it's a more suitable time for Asia. And that people don't believe it when we say that really is a company-wide meeting. That is a meeting that our founders run that is open to participation from any Googler anywhere in the world. And that, I think, sets the culture for the fact that ideas, questions, challenges can happen regardless of title, regardless of location, regardless of hierarchy.
There's a lot of flow of information. So the default is transparency, right? Which I think is a healthy thing because people feel informed. I think in some organizations or areas where, or even government, people use information as a gatekeeping function. And so when you open that up, you sort of, it's like flowers blooming. You can see, you know, all these lights go off around the place, and transparency of information, I'd say, is another key and kind of critical factor.
We've got a lot to learn in terms of these examples. Could you apply that to where you work? Last question before I wrap things up. Sir, coming to you in the microphone.
I was thinking about this idea of ideas can come from anywhere. How do you harness this philosophy at a countrywide level? I'm asking this because most of the times the government funds, or they're looking for ideas in universities and labs, whereas ideas could be in other places as well. Like Bertha Hansen is trying an experiment. And in Singapore's context, you have so many agencies, you know. Let's say I have an idea. I don't know who to go to. Do I go to IDA? Do I go to Spring Singapore? And I'm just sitting static like that. So if you think of this problem at a countrywide level, how can you unleash the energies of people from different walks of life and different stages?
Shall I have a go first? I think for me it's about, I know obviously institutions of all descriptions play important roles, particularly where it's about capital. But I think it's about not getting, from my perspective, it's about not getting too caught up with the institution, but about people connecting with people. The technology is an incredible enabler, but actually at the end of the day you need people with ideas and people with a passion to take them forward. And I think that's where the clusters come into play. That's where you will have universities next to businesses, next to the dropout who's sitting in that Wi-Fi connected cafe, who's got an even better idea than perhaps all of them, but needs support. And it's about not necessarily having all the solutions yourself, but finding counterparts who have discipline, who have expertise in disciplines that you don't. So that cluster impact is very, very valuable, and I think that's one of the soft values of a place like Silicon Valley or any other tech hub in the world. So again, it's about creating not just the infrastructure, not just the funds in that formal capacity, but creating spaces that allow smart people to connect and be energized and to springboard from smart people. If the great ideas are there, particularly if they have scale, particularly if they solve a new problem, then the funds and the backers will follow. That's what they're looking for too.
Julian, anything to add to the idea of the boundaries that people see?
Well, you try and hire people who are willing to break the boundaries.
Well, we don't see those.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's easy to say, it's a bit cliche, but you know, genuinely, I think if you hire people who at least allow the boundaries to blur a little, that's when you get real big changes.
I'm going to have to wrap things up, Susan. If I can ask you to leave the last word with you. We've talked a lot about what can be done to foster innovation in our society. If there was any kind of policy change or policy implementation that could help do that, what would you like to see happen?
I think for me it would be a case of don't lose sight of the incredible opportunity when you're addressing legitimate questions and concerns and issues that come up along the way, but never lose sight of the broader context, because that's when you lose the opportunities. And also for any country looking to be a hub, that's where you lose also the opportunities to stay globally competitive. And it's a global world in terms of internet technology and the digital economy.
What if an innovator feels limited? They've applied for funds and they don't meet this criteria, they don't meet that criteria, they can't work with this person, they can't work with that person. What does that innovator do?
I think if they believe passionately enough in their ideas, they should keep pursuing it. Perseverance, beats resistance if it's a great idea. And keep looking until you find those that do share your view, or at least are willing to give give it a shot, to bet on a good outcome. As Julian mentioned earlier, some of the biggest successes that Google has come up with, continues to work on, are the ones that seem crazy at the beginning. And slowly, they become more and more feasible. And they're supported by people willing to take a risk, willing to believe in the individual, willing to believe in the ambition, and people who know that you have to take those risks in order to find that fabulous success. So I think it's, embrace yourself with people like that and opportunities like, and keep sight of what's possible rather than what is challenging along the way.
Susan Pointer, Julian Bernard, thank you so much. A pleasure. Thank you for your time. Please have your seats below. A round of applause, please, for our Googlers on stage.